Hi, my name is Julia Elliott, and this is my short story collection, Hellions, which came out on April the 15th with Tin House Books. And basically, it's a collection of short stories, and the core concept of the Hellion is the organizing um, idea around the compilation of short stories. So in the South, I heard that term a lot growing up. A hellion is basically an unruly child who has the devil in them. I was accused of being a hellion many times. I'm not sure how much of a hellion I actually was, now that I'm looking at it from this perspective. So around 2023, I realized that Hellion, which is the title story of the collection and the title of the second story in the book, would make a really great sort of unifying concept. And so then I went back through all of the stories I've published since my last collection, which came out in 2014, and basically collected stories that have female characters who fit the concept of the Hellion. So about half of the characters in the book are adolescent or teenage characters who are like either unruly rebels who refuse to, comply to the standards of decency that society dictates for them, or they're weirdos, marginal in some way or another. And then you also have adult female characters who are sort of what I would describe as witch adjacent. They're sort of, roaming the border between the real and the surreal, the magic and the mundane. And so those characters are also hellions in a way, but not in the way that was sort of defined by, adults in my youth, right? That were like, you're a hellion, behave yourself. These women are also not behaving themselves, but there's more of a serious quality instead of a kind of mischievous, impish quality.
I'm always excited to read things that feel like the South, whether they're set in the South or not. I think that setting is definitely there, like in several of the stories. But I noticed that there were a lot of descriptions of like different vegetables and plants and bugs. And I wondered if you wanted to speak to that.
Yeah, so I've been asked a lot, are you a Southern Gothic writer? And so the way I always answer that is I have many influences, and some of them are Southern Gothic, and some of them are like, international writers like Gabriel Garcia Marquez. But what I'm most influenced by living in the South, and something you can probably relate to living in Florida, not right now, but at some point, and probably Seattle too, is just sort of the Southern Gothic ecology, which is this like relentlessly lush summer landscape that is like part of my kind of primordial imagination. And so there's something about like my creative mind that goes back to my childhood. And it's a Gen X childhood, growing up with a lot of time spent outside in the woods, that sort of thing. So in the first house that I ever lived in as a child, it was a rural town, but it was in a little tiny subdivision, and it was a ranch style house at the end of a road where all these other houses were going to be built, but it was surrounded by forest at the time. So it just seemed vast to me at the time. And so even the stories in this book that are not placed in the South, they do have this sense of a primordial forest. So I feel like the idea of the primordial forest goes back to my childhood in the Southern Gothic ecology and what I call the psychedelic summers of the South that are like really intense. They're screaming cicadas, throbbing, I call them in one story, it's like blaring like summer's engine. You get the idea that vines can grow like a foot a day or something. Just a sort of overwhelmingly lush, active ecology. We have in the last house that we lived in, it was kind of near a river, and that backyard was really hard to keep under control. Like in the summer, the vines would just encroach the yard. And my husband had a vegetable garden back in the back, and it was always encroached by vines and weeds and everything. And so now we live in a different part of town, and it's not as intense, but it's still like pretty intense in the South. There's a certain part of the summer where everything just kind of takes over. And, we have a pretty intense cicada season. We have lots of lizards creeping around, possums, raccoons, we keep chickens in the backyard, so we're always, keeping a lookout for possums and raccoons, and they're fine as long as you have the chickens, in their coop at night. But I feel like I'm really connected to this idea of a kind of primordial forest that is both real to me and part of my childhood. It's also a space where my imagination sort of flourishes. And so both the medieval stories and the Southern stories have these kinds of forests, even though they're probably different. Like the descriptions are a little bit different, but the sort of metaphoric impact is probably similar.
That makes sense. And I definitely can relate to that. I feel like something that's so nice about living in Seattle, and one of the reasons that I live here, is that there aren't like bug infestations in the walls of every place that I live, which I just like, I'm so stunned that exists on the planet, like I haven't, the glow hasn't gone away yet. I've been here for like 10 years and I'm just like still so that there are no.
I have read things about the nightmarish fecundity of Florida and like bugs spewing from things. And we do have palmetto bugs, and they get into our house, and there's definitely an uptick in bug sightings this time of year.
Yeah.
But I do put out little things. Like that's the only insect that I'm not like friendly towards, because it's like the inside of my house. I let the house spiders, I leave them alone, and they actually kill roaches sometimes, and that's nice. But yeah. So
yeah.
But I've heard that Florida is even more intense that way.
It's pretty wild, but the thing that I miss though is sort of what's represented in your book, which is just, and what you were just talking about, just the critters everywhere. Like I rarely even see like a stray cat here, or there's like there's nobody to talk to. There's no like little animals to chat with.
Yeah.
Like, the other night, a raccoon, I have a big heritage tree that I'm not allowed to touch that has this branch that hangs over my driveway. And I was about to get out of the car and the branch went like boom. And this like big old raccoon had like jumped onto it and it didn't hold him up and he kind of scrambled. And it was the first time in like 5 years that I've seen a wild animal here. I mean, I was just
really
so happy.
Well, he's in the area, he or she. Yeah, one of my friends who lives in Charleston saw a mother raccoon with the plastic garbage bag draped over her back like Santa Claus, ambling up a tree to feed her. Do you call them cubs, or raccoon babies cubs? Probably. Anyway, so that was like a hilarious image. Yeah, there are quite a few. I go on walks in the neighborhood. I see geese. I see rabbits. I see raccoons and possums constantly like skittering across the road and hiding under like things and then peeking out. And sometimes like there's this raccoon that's kind of big that will just stop in the middle of the road on its hind legs looking at me. And I'm like, all right. And I'm afraid to cross him, I don't know. I'm not afraid of raccoons, but I'm not going to walk up to one and, try to pet it.
Yeah, they're gnarly. I love possums though. I wish I saw some possums. I love those little guys. They're awesome.
Yeah, they're amazing. They're so strange.
Yeah. And that's kind of a good segue, because I was thinking a lot about like, and I'm not even sure how to articulate this, but sort of like the strange pathways to power that your characters find. And I didn't totally try.
Oh, I love that.
Noticed it at some point. I was like, I wonder if that's sort of a through line too. And I wonder if you have anything to say about power or women's power. It seems like there's something in there in this book.
Yeah, it's not like all the stories have happy endings, but I do feel like in every one there is a kind of arc. Well, I mean, especially the first one. Like she definitely has kind of a doomful ending. But for the most part, a lot of them do come to a kind of like awareness, like at the end of the story, of limitations or possibilities, I would say. And I guess the kind of like a really good reference story for that would be the Earl King story, which is, it's mostly a reference to the Angela Carter version, because that's a German myth that goes all the way back before Goethe, and then there's a Goethe poem that I'm not really that interested in. But like the Earl King was like a figure of death that supposedly gathered children. And I think in the Goethe poem, he's like riding a horse or something. And so in the Angela Carter story, it's about like this kind of magical forest man that seduces young girls and turns them into birds. And at the end of the story, the narrator sets the birds free, and she doesn't get turned into a bird. And so in my story, it's kind of going back to, my collegiate years where before the Me Too movement, where professors would blatantly seduce young students and, with no consequences. And there was a young woman on my hall in the dorm, who would tell us all about this art professor she was dating, the art professor. And she really glamorized him to almost mythological proportions. And I was thinking, like, what is this? I could see right through it. I never did that. I'm not like bragging or anything and saying that she was a dupe, but I just didn't get it. And so then I kind of thought about this, and I thought about like the power of the professor as a form of like enchantment, where you're not just trying to seduce someone, but you're passing down this like semi-mystical knowledge, because that's what the humanities are like, right? And so this humanities professor is, training her, and he seems to have all of these powers, and, she learns these things. But then she kind of invents her own magic and has her own transformation. And it's, a completely different thing from his version. And so at the end, she basically like not only comes into her own as her own sort of practitioner, but she's also aware of his exploitation of like younger women, and it's kind of what keeps him alive, sort of like a vampire. He has to have like a constant stream of them. And so she basically saves a young woman who's kind of like bewitched by him all of a sudden. And it's a little bit silly and a little bit hokey, but that's what it's getting at. And then so I feel like a lot of the other characters do have this sort of like, maybe it is an arc where they do have this moment of like self-awareness or something. And the story can be bleak, or it can be a semi-happy ending. I mean, I hope they're not cheesy happy endings, because that would be embarrassing. But but an idea of like some kind of mental change or transformation or self-awareness, where they can access the primal and the wondrous, and it might be a little scary, or it might be like a sort of like liberating thing.
Yeah, I love that. And I love that story. That's one of the stories that I'm going to teach, just because I feel like there's so many like amazing.
Oh, good.
Yeah, there's so many amazing things in it that I feel like, lately I've been trying to teach stories that students might argue a lot about. Like I can
Oh,
see.
good. Yeah.
Yeah.
And this would be really good for today's generation of students, because they might not understand that time in
Yes.
history, And when I talk about this story too, I talk about when I was sitting in the hall of my dorm and the student was talking about the professor. We were all like smoking cigarettes, and there was a cloud of smoke in the dorm, and that really dates me and dates it and dates the moment. So that's like one thing that you can talk about is like what's changed since then.
Yeah.
Are students more aware of the power dynamic with professors? Does this still happen? And, for a while there, I teach too, and some of my students were saying, oh, this would never happen now, but they're actually starting to talk about it happening again.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know what's going on. But one of my students said, I know some girls are obsessed with their professors again. And it seemed like that wasn't like happening for a while. So I don't know if there's been sort of a pop cultural shift where that's glamorized again, but that's interesting to talk about. And then the other thing that, it's a good way to introduce Angela Carter to the students,
Mm-hmm.
and the whole history of the Earl King and Goethe and the myth and all of that. So it'll give you plenty to talk about.
Right? It's so interesting. And I'm like an older millennial, so I grew up in Florida, so I kind of had like a very analog childhood, and I feel like a lot of these things that were happening in like modernity, I didn't have access to until I was like in my mid 20s when I left the
Oh yeah.
rural areas. And I also did my like grad school stuff way later, after I started having kids. So I can really like feel what the narrators or the main characters' friends felt like. Like I remember stuff like that. I remember when girls would be like kind of sucked into their professor's world, and then it's sort of like, do we help her,
Mhm.
or is it
Yeah.
like feminist to help, or is that like diminishing her autonomy? Like what do we
Good. Yeah.
do? So it's so rich, and also just how the professor changes form, you know.
Yeah. And then some, he seems like really handsome and young, and then like his age is very evident in other parts.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, that was kind of like my thoughts when I was watching the film Nosferatu, and they expected us to believe that somehow this. Yeah, did you see this movie,
I haven't yet, but I
the
won't spoil
Eggers
it, don't
movie?
worry.
But it's like I love Eggers and I love The Witch and I love The Lighthouse, but I thought The Northman was pretty bad, and then Nosferatu is like I have mixed feelings about it because they present this like hysterical woman who's just has the hots for an undead man, and she's just twitching with desire for him. And they don't explain it. They don't explain it at all. It's like it's just there, and then they just try to capitalize on the intensity of a young woman who's like got the hots for an undead corpse with a mustache, a vampire, you know. And so I'm like, you know, they could have, and then they hint at maybe that she met him when she was like 12 or 13 and he somehow seduced her. And it's like, well, that's where the story is. Like, how does an ancient undead vampire seduce a young woman? Like, is it with knowledge? Does he shapeshift into something totally hot? Is she seeing something different? What's going on? And I feel like that movie missed out on, you know, explaining that. Like, what is the mystique? It just kind of like went really old school and expecting you just to go with that narrative, you know, like, oh yeah, of course she wants the ancient undead disgusting vampire. Why wouldn't she? But no, no, why? So
That's
there's a little bit of that in this story, but this story definitely predates that film. But it's, you know, tapping into the same kind of thing where it's like sophisticated, vampiric, otherworldly male figures seduce young women, and how do they do it?
mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Whatever. So
I think that's great. I don't feel like we ask that question a whole lot ever. It's like that's just not interrogated. And I think it's one of those things, I have like I'm autistic, so I've always just felt like I just don't understand it. Like it's just me not understanding.
no, I don't understand it either.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I understand it like politically, sort of
Mhm.
intellectually. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Like as a women's and gender studies professor, you know, I'm like, okay, the power dynamic. The
Yeah.
women are seduced by the power, but the Nosferatu doesn't even explore that. Like what I wanted was a scene where the vampire was approaching a young woman in the woods and giving her secret knowledge that was so bewitching that she was like excited about it or something. But
Yeah.
no, it's just, you know,
Yeah. Yeah, totally.
no explanation.
It's like the idea that actually happens, and that happens in your story. It's like actual knowledge is transferred, which I've always been sort of
Yeah.
skeptical of. Like I've always wondered, like, are the people who are, sleeping with their professors actually getting something out of it? Like, what and
I
what,
mean,
and
yeah,
if so.
would you like? I remember when I was very young and I went to college and I was extremely naive. And it's not just like you don't know all the academic stuff, but you also don't know like what are the cool bands? What are the, and then like I would have embarrassing taste in music and I would go to the record store, which was called Papa Jazz, and it's still here and it's like legendary. And there were these old hippie men running it and they would laugh at my record purchases, and it was almost like a secret society of occult music enthusiasts there. And then it's like slowly I learned all these things like oh yeah, this band that I liked is embarrassing, and now I understand this because I came from a small town and I didn't have access. And then you do learn, like maybe a professor would laugh at you because you're still reading like Kurt Vonnegut or something, you know, and
Hmm.
you don't know about like, I don't know, Angela Carter or Gabriel Garcia Marquez or some, you know what I mean? And so they can, I think that an older person can be a repository for knowledge, but then the correct way to transfer it is through mentorship, not seduction. I mean, but human beings are messy, and who am I to say? Like, but I
Hmm.
know that like I'm a teacher, and I, you know, am imparting my like ancient hag knowledge to my students, you know,
Hmm.
and they are eager to learn about these things. And then so to introduce like sexual seduction into the mix is, you know, a potent and complicated thing.
Hmm.
And it happened a lot. And to be fair, I was speaking with some colleagues of mine that went to graduate school with me, and we were actually talking about the story. And they said it was kind of awkward when they were talking to their students about it because they're teachers, right? And so, and they're very ethical teachers, but it
Hmm.
was still awkward to talk to your teacher about the very thing of a professor seducing a teacher.
Hmm.
And so then we were reminiscing about grad school, and they were telling me about female professors who did the same thing. And like, oh, you
Totally.
didn't know this? You know, they were seducing their students too. So it is like part of the patriarchal, you know, power, but, and it's definitely done more often by like the men before a certain period, but it was also happening with women in academia back
Yeah,
in the day as well.
I remember that too.
So,
Very
yeah.
much. Um, so you told me that you collected stories from like 10 years ago or so and to put this together. How was the publishing process? Did you have an agent or
Yeah,
like
it was very complicated. So I do have an agent, and I have a new agent now, but my older agent, she wanted, she was like, you need to publish another book because it's been like a gap, you know? And then I had a novel that didn't work out. And so it was like, let's do your short stories. And I was like, I don't feel like they're quite coalescing, but I compiled them and it didn't work out. And the reason why, and I'm very relieved now, is because there was no coherent central concept.
Mhm.
They were good stories, but there was no like unifying thing going on. And so, like I said, around 2023, I was thinking about the story Hellion, which is the title story. And I was like, you know, that would make a great title for the collection. And I'm only going to pick stories that fit that idea. And then it turned out that every story in this book, they go back to 2017 or 2018 and then all the way up to 2025. So that means that some of the earlier stories that I wrote between, I think maybe, yeah, 2018 is the oldest publication date, but probably written in 2017. So that means that there were early stories between the Wilds, my first collection, and this one that didn't make it into the collection, and even some later stories that didn't make it into the collection because they don't fit the concept. But because it's like 2018 to 2025, it also not only, you know, the stories are not only chosen for the concept of Hellions, but it also, they just kind of channel my obsessions from that period. And
Mhm.
so I was immersing myself a lot in um, surrealist occult painters and writers like Leonora Carrington and Remedios Varo, just kind of obsessed.
Mhm.
Um, and so that really kind of comes through too. Uh, you know, and then I designed a course, oh, well, two courses that I've been teaching while writing these stories that are very important. One is about female monsters in horror films.
Mhm.
And so I'm immersed in female monster theory, right?
Mhm.
So that's really influential. And I've been teaching that class since 2018. So that makes sense that it seeps into the collection. And then the other class has a section on surrealism and the occult. And so that's really like a part of it too, because the surrealist painters who were really like throwing themselves whole hog into like occult iconography during that time, they were very serious about it and they were like producing a lot of interesting work. And so I just kind of immersed myself itself and their symbology. And they were very playful about it too. So it wasn't like totally cheesy woo-woo kind of stuff. There's a lot of fun stuff too. And so that's like been heavily influential. And then Leonora Carrington, one of my favorites, she also wrote fiction, and she died in 2018. And so her books have been reissued, and she's, enjoyed a renaissance since then.
Do you have anything to say about like getting us a short story collection published? I feel like I'm often in conversations with, agents and editors and writers, and right now I've basically heard that short stories, essay collections, and memoir are like extremely hard to sell or get published.
They are.
Yeah, and this was published with Tin House,
yeah.
which is amazing. It's a great press.
Yeah, but Tin House is known for taking risks and publishing things that they're devoted to. And The Wilds did surprisingly well. So that was a double book deal. So they bought my novel and my short story collection back then in, 2014 and 2015. And I think they probably expected the novel to do better, but the collection actually did better than the novel. And because it kind of fit in with like Karen Russell stuff, Kelly Link, there's definitely a lineage there. And so whenever I submitted this to Tin House again, like the unified Hellions version, they loved it. And they also told me that short story collections were enjoying a little renaissance. But I do think that indie presses are probably more likely to publish them than big presses. But I have talked to some short story writers who have recently had collections out with bigger presses, and I, don't feel comfortable naming them, but they have indicated that the bigger presses aren't so great about promoting them. Tin House is really good at niche promotion and, working with like all the bookstagrammers and influencers and just trying to really get it out there. And so I don't know. I mean, but no matter what, though, a story collection is just not going to sell as much as an equivalent novel. Although I do have novelist friends whose books aren't necessarily doing any better at the moment than others are. So, and then my novel didn't do as well as my first story collection. So indie presses are great for that. Although bigger presses do still publish them. Because I've been looking at the ones that are out right now, and some of them are from larger presses like Simon and Schuster.
Mm-hmm.
The Maiden. Our parents said the Watts were lunatics for putting a trampoline in their backyard, out behind their garage full of souped-up dirt bikes, in the tiny meadows still strewn with their dead horses' droppings, out where a honey locust had just burst into bloom. We didn't believe it until we saw it, hoisted by silver tubing, its round nylon bounce mat glimmering like a black lagoon in the endless summer light. We watched from the woods the first day of its glory, the Watts boys kickboxing in the air, performing backflips, torpedoing their agile bodies off the side and landing like Olympians in the long grass. Our parents said we'd knock out our teeth, break our necks, paralyze ourselves. Our parents said we'd suffer concussions, bashed noses, ruptured organs, broken limbs. But how could we resist the miracle of fake flight, the mockery of gravity's laws? How could we resist the girls that gathered each day in the fragrant shade of the honey locust, clad in tank tops and shorts, sun-tanned goddesses showing off their new curves? The girls bounced and laughed and danced in the air. The girls did slow-mo flips and gymnastic stunts, cheerleading leaps and ballet moves, all except the girl we called Cujo, a stunted, breastless, bitter thing, freckled, red-headed, bony as a shad. When she looked us over with her weird, bulging eyes, we felt a burn in our guts, as though her gaze had lasered through skin and muscle to singe our organs, changing us from the inside out. Cujo crept in the shade. Cujo mumbled foreign words, curses we suspected, for she came from North Augusta, from Irish travelers, people said. When Troy Hutto attempted a crash dive and fractured his femur, we spotted Cujo crouched under the trampoline, scratching in the dirt with a stick. When Tammy Day dislocated her elbow on the metal rim, we saw Cujo up in the honey locust, sprinkling leaf confetti onto the mat. When Chip Watts, King of the Air, piked off the tramp and landed on a brick that had not been there the day before, Cujo ate a fucking acorn. Hexing Chip, who spent the next 3 weeks earthbound and hobbling on a sprained ankle.